Hello, this is Dr. Lok, your G101 facilitator, and I'm now going to show you the 6P for problem 9. Now, today you look at the problem trigger, which is that they make some argument about young people. Now, let's look at how you approach the problem. Now, some of the things that you encounter today is what is an argument. Like today, there are certain arguments about young people being, a strawberry generation. They are not as strong as the older generation, which you probably have heard it from your, parents or maybe your grandparents. Okay, but we're going to see whether those arguments are valid or not. Okay, but first, let me just introduce some of the technical thing about argument. There are basically two types of arguments. One is the inductive argument, and the other one is the deductive argument. Okay, and we need to differentiate what is an inductive and deductive argument, and that will give you an indication of whether an argument is strong. Essentially, at the end of the day, you need to be able to look at the arguments or the conclusion and evaluate to see if they are good argument or not. Now, how are arguments made? Arguments are, to put it simply, they are usually made based on two basic elements. One are the premises. That means the facts, or maybe there's some statements that has been made. Okay, those premises can be true or not. Okay, and then based on those premises, you have a conclusion. So the example is this. Suppose there's this premise or a statement saying that all mushrooms are fungi, and the second statement or the premise is saying that this is not a fungus. So what can you conclude? Now that means this thing is not a mushroom, because if this thing is a mushroom, it would have been a fungi. But the fact that this is not a fungus means that this thing cannot be a mushroom. So in this case, it shows that the conclusion is quite good. Okay. Now let's get on to the two types of argument here: inductive and deductive. Now, what are inductive and deductive arguments? Essentially, what actually happens in the inductive argument is that you use something that is very special, you based on small observation or observation of something that's a small sample, and you try to generalize it to to the rest. Deductive, on the other hand, usually starts from something, okay, that is in general a bigger picture, and then you try to deduce the conclusion on something that's very small. Okay, so in the case of inductive argument, you do make a general inference to generalize it based on something that you observe that's very small. Okay, so that means the conclusion made is usually follow a form of probability. That means it's not certain. Later on we'll give some examples. Okay, deductive, on the other hand, the arguments usually has to be true, because you start from something that's very big, and then you zoom in into something that's very more specific. Okay, perhaps this will become clearer when I give you some examples. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have something inductive argument is the conclusion usually comes out to be probable. Okay, so for example, Peter has always gotten A in science module for the past 14 lessons. So, I'm quite sure he will get A in week 15 too. Now, in this case, the first sentence, Peter has always gotten A in science module for the past 14 lessons. These are the premises. Okay? Now, from this premise, you make a good guess as to, so I'm quite sure that he'll get A in week 15 too. It's a good guess, okay? But of course, there's no guarantee. Now, let's look at for example, this thing, the inductive argument again, the structure of inductive argument. So in this case, is in the previous example, the observation was based on 14 weeks, and he tried to generalize it into all 15 weeks. You could do it the other way around. For example, you could observe someone the daily grade for maybe 5 weeks, and you try to generalize it to all the 15 weeks. Okay. So this is a form of inductive argument. Deductive argument, on the other hand, start from something that's true, a general statement, and then you try to go into something more specific. For example, let's say you have this premise one, all men are mortals. Okay? So you start from there, the bigger picture. And then premise two, Socrates is a man. Okay? That means your conclusion will be the Socrates is mortal. Why? Because Socrates belongs to a man, okay, and all men are mortals, so Socrates has to be a man. Okay, so Socrates has to be mortal. Sorry, I said that wrongly. So in this case, you go from something that's general and you go to something more specific. Let me give you another example. Perhaps this should illustrate this even better. So for example, an inductive argument of could be something like this. Premise one is that Jason has a laptop, and this is true, observed to be true. Premise two, Jason is an RP student, and that is true. Now the conclusion is all RP students have laptop. Now this may or may not be true, but this conclusion was made based on inductive reasoning. Okay, that means you start from something more specific, you try to generalize to all the RP students in this case. Let's look at the other way. Another example, which in this case is deductive. So in deductive, you start off with something that's more general. So in this case, all RP students have laptop. Now assume that this is true, and if we have a second premise, which is that Jason is an RP student, which is also true, if you observe it to be true, then inevitable, the conclusion will be that Jason has laptop, and this must be true in this case. If this is true and this is true, then the conclusion here must be true. So essentially, there's a difference between the inductive and deductive argument. Okay. Now, so many problems are in fact arguments. I would say is inductive in nature. Give you an example. Inductive in the sense that you observe certain people behave certain way. You try to generalize it to the other population. So, for example, your parents or your grandparents might have observed a few youngsters being not as disciplined or not so well behaved, and they will usually make the statement something like, "Oh, young people nowadays are so not well mannered, badly behaved." Okay, this is a form of generalization, and the argument they use is actually inductive argument because they observe a few specific examples and they try to make it into the general population about young people. Another example of inductive reasoning. Okay, so for example, in NTU, a young student stabbed his professor. Then premise will be, the second premise, stabbing is a violent and impulsive act. So the conclusion will be, the young people are violent and impulsive. This again is a form of inductive reasoning, or to layman term, it means you try to stereotype someone based on a few examples that you see. Okay, a very generalization argument. Now, this on the other hand is a deductive reasoning. Now, suppose this is this premise we have. According to research, the unwillingness to work long hours shows that the workers are not resilient. And then that's the second premise. Generation Y workers we hire express that they are not willing to work long hours. Then the conclusion must be that therefore this generation Y workers we hire are not resilient. Now, if this premise is true and the second premise is also true, then this conclusion must be true. That's the deductive reasoning. Now, so when you look at today's problem, you should be able to learn, how sometimes a conclusion is derived. Okay, most of the time, as I mentioned, a lot of people derive the argument using inductive reasoning. Okay, but of course there are some you use deductive reasoning. So in your mind, you should, when you hear argument, you should be able to differentiate which one is inductive and which one is deductive, and hence from there you decide whether the argument is strong or not. Okay, so basically to summarize it, that's the lesson outcome. in an argument, whether it's inductive or deductive, you must identify the premises. Okay, in other words, the statements, and then follow from the statements and premises, you have a conclusion. Okay. Now, and also in some cases, there will be some unstated premises, and you must be able to differentiate between inductive and deductive arguments, and then explain how conclusions are derived through a process of logical interpretation of context. Okay, that means either through inductive or deductive reasoning. So basically, that's the main lesson outcome for P09. Thank you.